Can you hear me okay? Can you see me okay? Okay, great, thank you. So, welcome back to the International Roundtable plenary session. It's the second one. This morning we had the pleasure of listening to Dr. Melanie Yazzie, who talked to us about We Must Make Kin to Get Free, and that generated a great conversation. Before I introduce Dr. Marisa Ruiz Trejo, I just want to remind everyone that tonight from 8 to 9, we have another plenary session with filmmaker Adam Khalil, who will be introduced by our colleague Dr. Morgan Adamson. And the title of his talk is How to Commit Crimes Against Reality. Very enticing, so please come back for that. And tomorrow we have another plenary with Dr. Carol Boyce Davis on the semi-colony, decolonizing gaps and reparatory justice. And then from 2:20 to 4 p.m. we'll have everyone in conversation for the actual roundtable. So we're going to continue exploring the theme of the impossibilities of decolonizing power and knowledge with Dr. Marisa Ruiz Trejo's talk on Decolonize and Depatriarchalize knowledge through women and feminist thinkers from Chiapas and Central America. Dr. Ruiz Trejo is an anthropologist, writer, journalist, and activist from Chiapas, Mexico. She's professor at the Universidad Autónoma de Chiapas, where she directed the Cultural Diversity Studies and Social Spaces master's program from 2017 to 2019. In 2016, she contributed to the reports on racism, genocide, and sexual violence against Quechua, I wasn't sure how to pronounce that, against Quechua indigenous women in the Sepur Zarco case in Guatemala. This is the most significant legal case of sexual violence committed by the army during the genocide to be won in a domestic court in Guatemala. She is also the author of many articles, and her recent publications include the co-edition of Feminist Anthropologies in Mexico, Epistemologies, Ethics, Practices, and Diverse Views. It also includes the edition of Decolonize and Depatriarchalize the Social Sciences, Memory and Life in Chiapas, Central America, and the Caribbean, both published in 2020, and she is the author of Make a Body, Pawe Uwash Ulu U Biam, America Latina, from 2021. So let's give her a warm welcome. Especially today, she comes from Mexico, and it's a little cold today here in St. Paul, so let's give her a warm applause. Start this. Oh, oops. I think we need tech help. Oh, here it is.
Okay, perfect.
Voilà.
Thank you, Joel. Oops. Okay. Buenas tardes a todas, a todos y a todes. Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to thank Joel Vitiello for being the heart of this activity and all of you at the Kofi Annan Institute for Global Citizenship. And I also would like to thank Carmen Valdivia at the Spanish Department for supporting my work. Today, I will present one of my recent research projects about women and feminist thinkers from Chiapas and Central America. I was born in Chiapas, the southern of Mexico, and I was raised in Tuxtla Gutiérrez, a city near the border of Guatemala. When I was a child, my parents were involved in the organization of some encounters between writers, artists, activists, and exiled people from Central America that went to Chiapas for denouncing the horrible situation that revolutionary movements in Guatemala, Nicaragua, and El Salvador were living in the 80s due to the army intern conflicts. Those meetings marked my childhood, and all those events are part of my collective memory. In recent years, as a transfeminist researcher and activist, I have been interested in the history of women and feminists in anthropology in Chiapas and Central America because my navel and my heart are in that history and in that land. Chiapas, as part of Central America, is a complex region with cultural diversity, forces in opposition, process of memory, decolonization and depatriarchalization, as well as resistances of colonial and neo-colonial capitalism. In this presentation, I will be partial because I pretend to show you just some of my selections in the genealogies of women in social knowledge. My research is divided into several periods, from the early contributions of the pioneering women in anthropology from 1940 to 1964, the participation of Marxist, feminist, Gramscian, and anti-colonial women thinkers in context of repression in Central America from 1964 to 1989, to the investigations of feminist, indigenous, Afro-descendant, and LGBT anthropologists of the new generations with different challenges, from 1990 to 2000. Those periods are not linear, meaning that they can happen simultaneously. My methodology is based on feminist ethnography. I did fieldwork in Mexico, Guatemala, and New York from 2016 to 2001. I did more than 20 interviews with different women anthropologists and thinkers, and I reviewed different institutional and personal archival collections. The recovery of the life and works of women and feminists has not been an easy task because although there is a lot of material, it is scattered and has not been analyzed as a whole. In the first period, I worked on the pioneering women in anthropology in Chiapas and in Central America. As in most areas of scientific knowledge, Mexican anthropology was dominated by males from its beginning in the post-revolutionary period from the 1920s to the 1930s to the golden age of anthropology, named for its close link with the Mexican state in the project of incorporating indigenous people into Mexican society. Several of those pioneering women in my region were born in Europe and here in the United States. Some of them were communist, exiled women, or fled fascism. At the same time, they collaborated with different projects of American universities, such as the University of Chicago and Harvard University. Their ethnographies documented the worldview of different indigenous communities and focused on kinship systems, but some works, such as Jung Nash research, focus on inequalities in the capitalist system. In this sense, several of the pioneering women of anthropology in my region were the first women working into the disciplines. But even though they were women, They were influenced by the currents of British and North American cultural anthropology and the indigenous Mexican policies at that time. In that sense, some research of that period may reproduce certain ethnocentric forms. Several of the pioneering women in Chiapas and Central America had as professors Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict, who were two referents of the discipline of anthropology. Ruth Benedict adopted more inclusive language to describe sexual behaviors than previous writers. Margaret Mead, well known for her work on adolescence and sexuality, is most often identified as one of the first feminist ethnographers. Some scholars also engage in writing ethnographies in various forms, including novels, autobiographies, life stories, and travel narratives. Zora Neale Hurston was the first Black student at Barnard College in the 1920s and graduated in 1928 with a BA in anthropology. Her contributions have often been minimized in the discipline, but she has been widely recognized for her work as a novelist, journalist, and playwright. According to Faye Harrison, a Black feminist anthropologist, a variety of factors contributed to this trend, not the least of which was the racism that permitted the discipline at that time, but in addition, at a time when ethnographic research focused primarily on Native North American in the US and non-Western cultures, Hurston's ethnographic work centered on her hometown of Eatonville, an African-American community in Florida. From October 1947 to February 1948, Zora lived in Honduras, and there is not much research on this time in Central America. I find very important to mention her because we need to recognize the life and work of first African-American anthropologists. Zora Neale Hurston, Audre Lorde, and Kimberly Crenshaw contributed on Black feminist anthropology, and I would like to highlight the important work of Faye Harrison and Irma McLaurin that recovered the life and work of Black feminist anthropologists. The second period of my project goes from 1964 to 1989. In this period, I identify some anthropologists and thinkers that I refer as rebels and revolutionary women. In this period, I identify thinkers like Alaide Fopa, Estela Juan Rosell, Aura Marina Arriola, Marta Casau Zarzú, Mercedes Olivera, Valda Barrios, Yolanda Aguilar, and Myrna Mack, interested in the situation of indigenous women, peasants, and Ladino mestizas. In this period, I identify that they were Marxist and socialist feminist thinkers from Mexico and Guatemala that criticized the traditional notion of class. They were professors at Central American and Mexican universities influenced by Gramscian and the anti-colonial thought. Some of those women participated in social and revolutionary movements in Central America. It is important to say that this period was a dramatic historical moment in Central America for socialist activists and Mayan communities that experienced repression, persecution, disappearance, murders, and massacres. There were political conflicts, counterinsurgency policies, the genocide in Guatemala, which strongly affected students, teachers, researchers, and activists. Some of them were imprisoned, threatened, disappeared, but also murdered. Those women thinkers in that period denounced the massacres and accompanied survivors of sexual violence. I would like to highlight the work of Alaide Fopa, that was born to a Guatemalan mother and an Argentinian father. She spent a big part of her life in Guatemala. I recovered her work because she was one of the pioneering women in feminist studies in Mexico and was influenced by Marxist feminist theories. She published an article about the salary for domestic work in 1978 that I had analyzed in my work, and she was the founder of FEM, one of the first feminist magazines in Mexico. Her children participated in the guerrilla army, and in looking for her children, Alaide disappeared in 1980 in Guatemala City, and until today, we still don't know anything about her. And actually, she was a professor of my mother. This story represents the trajectory of many of the women professors and students of that period that experienced the effects of the genocide in Guatemala. Now, I will talk briefly about Estela Kwan. She was a Guatemalan anthropologist with Chinese descendants, and she was exiled in Mexico. In her thesis, she presented the stories of some Guatemalan intellectuals exiled in Mexico, and she wrote as an exiled Guatemalan woman about other exiled people in Mexico that had similar experiences to her. She participated with Alaide Fopa in FEM and in Foro de la Mujer, one of the first feminist radio shows in Mexico. With Alaide Fopa, Stella Kwan created the International Association of Women Against the Repression in Guatemala, gathered material about the violence to denounce it, and disseminated information about this horrible political situation in Central America. Her organization contributed with research and provided assistance and accompaniment to victims of violence and rape, and is an example of one of the first groups of women anthropologists organized at the end of the 70s between Mexico and Guatemala that contributed with their expertise to protest this context of repression. This is a relevant fact for the genealogies of Mexican and Central American feminist anthropology that illustrates how anthropologists have used the documentation and registration tools of the discipline to organize against repression. On the other hand, I would like to mention Mercedes Olivera, because she was born in Mexico City in 1934, but she moved to Chiapas in the 80s. She was also influenced by Marxist feminism, and she was interested in the study of the exploitation of women within the capitalist system. Her studies constitute one of the bases of the intersectional theory of Latin America, with which the capitalist exploitation of women in the system is problematized. Mercedes Olivera analyzes the double and triple discriminations that indigenous, poor folk, and women face. Olivera uses the concept of female oppression to differentiate it from exploitation as workers and refers to the effect of a historical process in which the labor force that women produce is not recognized as work and therefore is not paid. This oppression has not been considered as an economic exploitation of the system, nevertheless constitutes the pillar of the functioning of said system. Her concept, female oppression in the late 1970s, contributed to the understanding that women are relegated to the production and maintenance of the labor force through housework that serves the purpose of labor and reproduction of life. These contributions continue to be valid in several of the Central American countries, especially when contemplating these oppressions that intersect in the case of class relations. When the woman joins the productive work and hires another woman to do the domestic chores, there exists an exploitation of women by women. In addition to the feminist theory of the region, Olivera contributed with the idea the category woman cannot be understood in an homogeneous way, since female oppression is not the same for some women as for others. I would like to mention very quickly the work of Marta Casaus, a historian from Guatemala, because actually she was one of my professors, and in the 80s she was involved in social movements in Guatemala, and she was interested in the struggles of revolutionary movements. She published a very important book called Racism and Lineage in 1992, a book about how racism of the oligarchies in Guatemala produced a genocide between 1982 and 1983 in Guatemala. Her work contributed to expert witness trial reports, for example, in the case for genocide against Efraín Ríos Montt and the Sepur Sarco case, where I also participated. Furthermore, Balda Barrios was a Guatemalan socialist and feminist anthropologist. She was exiled to Mexico twice, first in the 50s when she was a child, and after she went back to Guatemala, and in the 80s, she was forced to leave Guatemala again. In Chiapas, Balda Barrios created a workshop called Ancetic, Women in Tzotzil Language, and Ancetic was a space where different researchers and activists discussed and struggled against the criminalization of the abortion and against sexual violence. Ancetic was also the first feminist magazine in Chiapas. Balda Barrios was interested in the situation of women in socialist societies. She spent 10 months in the German Democratic Republic and in the socialist China, and her articles of that time are a rich source of interactions with workers, intellectuals, housewives, between others. She published many books and articles about violence against indigenous and peasant women in Chiapas and in Guatemala, about reproductive justice for girls, and about repression against LGBT communities. Between the 90s and the beginning of the 21st century, I observed that those women in anthropology in Chiapas and in Central America participated in different memory and justice process. In that sense, I also would like to share with you the story of Myrna Mack, a Guatemalan anthropologist who worked with the population displaced by the internal armed conflict in Guatemala, and that was the founder of Avanzo, an independent center of research in Guatemala that is still working and producing very interesting researchers as Marco Chivalán Carrillo, Lucia Bonilla, and Clara Arenas. In 1990, Myrna Mack was murdered by the Guatemalan armed forces due to her critical positions of the government's treatment of indigenous Mayans and her denunciation of human rights abuses. I also would like to talk about another Guatemalan anthropologist that was the founder of CANIL, an independent center of formation and healing in Guatemala City, where diverse women and feminists participate with a holistic perspective. This center provides support to social movements, institutions, and collectives who at the same time support other people. CANIL has a wonderful archive about feminist movements in Central America, and it is another example of the organization of feminist anthropologists in Central America. Yolanda Aguilar has worked on historical memory through the testimonies of women survivors and women that experienced sexual violence during the armed conflict. She wrote different articles, and her most recent book is Femestizajes, Bodies, and Mestiza Ladina Racialized Sexualities. She was part of different projects with other important feminist thinkers from Guatemala, like Ana Cofiño and Ana Silvia Monzón. I would like to mention the work of Irma Alicia Velázquez Nimartú. She is the first Mayan Quiche woman that earned a doctorate in social anthropology and initiated the court case that made racial discrimination illegal in Guatemala. She published several books that contributed to decolonize epistemologies, and she was the forefront of the struggles for respect for indigenous cultures in Guatemala and in different parts of Central America. In this period, I analyzed the decolonial epistemic resistance, and I observed the proliferation of feminist, indigenous, Afro-descendant, and LGBT plus anthropologists of the new generations with different challenges. I won't have time to explain other writers that I would like to mention here and thinkers because we don't have time, but I would like to talk very quickly about a book called Decolonize and Depatricarcalize, the Social Sciences, Memory and Life in Chiapas, Central America, and the Caribbean, edited in 2020 by my home institution, the Universidad Autónoma de Chiapas, because this book, it is a rebel moment in my life and has 14 chapters, and it includes results of anthropological studies, original and collaborative research, creative theoretical reflections, epistemologies, ethics, essays, and poetry. The authors of this book are Marta Casau Sarzu Mayra Santos Febres, Irmalicia Velázquez Nimartú, Victoria Sanford, Xochitl Leiva, Ruperta Bautista, Georgina Méndez, Juana María Ruiz Ortiz, Yolanda Aguilar Urizar, Victoria Sanford, María Guadalupe García Hernández, Mabel Dalila Morales Sánchez, Tito Millán Salayón, Montserrat Aguilar, Anneli Villa Avendaño, and me. In this presentation, I will talk quickly about some of the chapters in this book because they are related with the last period of my work. I would like to highlight the work of Juana Ruiz Ortiz, a Tzotzil writer born in 1951 in San Pedro Chenaló, Chiapas, Mexico. In this book, she collaborates with a poem called Manita de León, or Moncera. The little lion's hand, or Moncera, is a common plant in southern Mexico and in other parts of Central America, as well as in the Altos de Chiapas, where Juana María Ruiz Ortiz was born. Little lion's hand, Manita de León in Spanish, or Yunicop León in Tzotzil, is often used as an alternative medicine to cure diabetes, heart or blood pressure conditions, although it has medicinal properties and it is frequently considered bad wheat due to its abundance, which exposes it to destruction. In the poem that appeared in this book, Juana Ruiz Ortiz makes an analogy between the way in which humans treat plants and the way in which some men treat women. To use poems is a way to decolonize and to depatriarchalize knowledge. First, because it considers transdisciplinary approaches, and second, because it allows inter-knowledge collaboration, meaning alternate different genres and disciplines that are rarely visible in the dominant academic space. This collaboration refers to introducing new textual forms into academic narrative, such as the philosophical essay, poems, videos, scripts, movable files, documents, activation of spaces and performance, among others. On the other hand, María Guadalupe García, the founder of the organization Mamá Maquin, is one of the authors of the book. Mamá Maquin is a group that was created in 1990 by Mam Canjobal, Quechí, and Chuj Mayan women who took refuge in Mexico in the 80s. Since its foundation, during the internal armed conflict in Guatemala, has fought against sexist inequalities, racist, classist, and injustice in the distribution of land. In this book, Las Mujeres de Mamá Maquin tell us their own history. Their chapter recovers their research process outside the university and their methodologies. We are not just interested in academic canon research, but in social organizations, social movements, and other literary and artistic groups and spaces for healing trauma. Another author of this book is Georgina Méndez, a Mayan Chol anthropologist with a PhD in anthropology. She's a professor at the Universidad Intercultural de Chiapas. She was worked on the contributions made by indigenous women from political and social organizations and civil associations, and she focused on poets and writer women in Mayan languages, such as Ruperta Bautista, Miquea Sanchez, Adriana Lopez, and Juana Peñate. Finally, I would like to add that the incorporation of lesbians, trans people, and non-binary people into the system of production of knowledge have also contributed to create new perspectives to rethink the category man, woman, and another dissident gender identities in our current societies. Some of the most representative names in my region are María Lugones, Lucas Avendaño, Amaranta Gómez Regalado, Dorotea Gómez, Diego Falconi, Johan Mijail, Sayak Valencia, Tito Millán Salayón, Claudia Rosas Ríos, Daniel Coleman, Lía García, Numa Dávila, Manuel Soc, Marco Chivalán Carrillo, Nancy Wense, among others. Those are some of the authors and readers of the book, and I wanted to show how we are doing circulate knowledge. And I will finish with some reflections. With this presentation, I wanted to argue that there is a reduced presence of Latin American women as authors, as well as reduced presence of indigenous and Afro-descendant women and queer people as authors. That's why decolonizing, but also depatriarchalizing frameworks of knowledge can contribute to change the North American Eurocentric epistemic hierarchies. Anti-colonial and feminist epistemologies have proposed decolonial possibilities for social sciences, humanities, social movements, but also memory and life. As we observed in this presentation, writings by indigenous and Afro-descendant women and feminists, sexual dissidents, revolutionaries, and social activists have created epistemic ruptures to the dominant imaginaries of knowledge. In Latin America, the emergence of anti-colonial, decolonial, and LGBT plus movements denounced the coloniality of power and knowledge. The participation of rebels and revolutionary women in anthropology, who also participated in revolutionary, social, and feminist movements, had a strong impact on their epistemic production. Women and feminists from Chiapas and Central America faced different problems to those of feminist theorists in other contexts. Women and feminists from Chiapas and Central America faced different problems to those of feminist theorists in other contexts, such as the Anglo-Saxon context, particularly because, I will finish. I don't know what happened, but I assure you I will finish. I don't know what happened. Okay, so I will try to continue.
I'll see what I can do.
Okay. Perfect, thank you. Okay, so women and feminists from Chiapas and Central America face different problems to those of feminist theorists in other contexts, such as the Anglo-Saxon context, particularly because of the Central American civil wars, the genocide in Guatemala, imperialism, militarism, paramilitarism, and mining extractivism. As we observed in this presentation, there is a link between the academic and the political field to reframe debates on racism, colonial exploitation, sexual violence, but also economic and cultural justice. The contributions of women, feminists, and sexual dissidents in Central America can help us to rethink the research process. I hope that the work of all those women and feminists continue being known by the new generations of social sciences and humanities students, not only in Chiapas and Central America, but in other parts of the world. For me, this is one of the ways to decolonize and to depatriarchalize knowledge that can help us to fight, but also to heal our hearts, as I heal my heart here today, sharing this presentation with you. Thank you y muchas gracias a todas por escucharme.
So we have about 25 minutes for questions, and we have 2 microphones at work. So if you have questions, you can come to the microphone and ask questions. And just take the time, want to take the time to think through some questions. I think if you have questions, please come. Maybe I have one for you, and we'll use the microphone. Someone has a question. I'll be sure.
Okay, can I ask you to speak slowly, please?
I'll try.
Okay.
Jay Wilkinson, went to school here a long time ago. Are you aware of any interactions between particularly the Native women leaders that you have worked with and folks from the International Indian Treaty Council, American Indian Movement, Women of All Red Nations, the other indigenous groups, many of which were founded here in the Twin Cities?
Yes, actually, I think, yeah, no, it was, okay, perfect. Thank you very much, and thank you for your question.
The question was, does she know about relationships between the indigenous women leaders in Central America and the International Indian Treaty Council, American Indian Movement, and other organizations founded here in the Twin Cities in the 60s, 70s, 80s?
Yes.
They're still pretty active.
Okay, I know a little more the connections now because I participated in the Hijas de la Madre Tierra. That was an encounter at New York University, Earth to the Mother Earth. And we organized this event with Pamela Calla, one of my professors that is from Bolivia. And we observed that there are a lot of connections between indigenous research women and Native American women research in the US. But I think that can be very interesting to find the connections between them in those in the years before. Thank you for your question. I think that I need to look for that because there are not archival archives, and maybe we need to invent more or to imagine other archives. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, it's Carol Boyce Davies. It's so lovely to hear your work. The problem is that the knowledge goes usually in a unidirectional way from here to Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean. So I really want to know about this book because it should be more available to people like us working here, the decolonize, depatriarchalize. How can one get access? Is it like Amazon? Is it available everywhere? How can I get?
No,
Or
unfortunately.
is there any way that
Yeah.
we can share that knowledge?
No, thank you very much, Carol. I admire a lot your work, and it is like I feel humble that you are here. Actually, this is a very weird book that we have just like 500 copies, but it is available in internet, and you can look for the name, and you will find it free, and you can read it. But unfortunately, it's just in Spanish. But maybe we will do some collaborations and to translate it. But I have one copy for you. No, thank you. Wow, it is incredible that Carol is here. Yeah, actually, I wanted to read some of the poems with you, but I didn't have time to translate the poems. And I was also thinking that it is important to talk before with the authors, because anthropologists, they used to do that, to translate things without talking with Indigenous and Afro-descendant women, and I don't want to do that, and I would like to do a collaborative work. But the last part of the book is very interesting because we are reivindicating that poetry is a way to build knowledge, and is a way to analyze racism, analyze injustice, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and I think that poetry is a genre that academic knowledge doesn't consider as an important genre. Yeah. Yeah, a question.
Can you hear me? Does it work? Okay. Maybe we'll better without mask. I want to follow up on something that Professor Boyce Davis said, that usually inner knowledge flows in one direction. And so it's usually from academia to academia, and,
Yeah.
and, and maybe a little bit outside of academia. But some of the texts some of the knowledge created by the women and indigenous people you worked with, or that you collaboratively worked with to produce this book, seem to be from grassroots organizations, and my understanding of Central America wars, for instance, and some revolutionary movements, is that they are often associated with educational components, and whether it's Marxist knowledge or Marxist education, anti-capitalist education, but that there are, it's a very important component. But then how does it flow out? Is it usually kind of remaining within particular communities, or is it, can it like flow back to the academia, like what you're trying to do in this book?
Yeah. Yeah,
I don't know if my question was so clear. but-
No, it was like a very interesting comment. Thank you very much, Joel. Actually, I was going to tell you that in this picture, we are the first presentation of the book. We went to this community that the name of the community is Nueva Esperanza in Guatemala. And I feel very proud because the first presentation was there and not in a university. And we are with the Mama Makin women. And they wrote one of the chapters of the book. And I feel very proud because I receive a lot of emails and in my Facebook, a lot of women, indigenous women from Guatemala and from other parts of Latin America, they say thank you for this book because it is not just for academia but also for social organizations. And also those women in this picture, if you can see, they have the book, and they feel very proud that they wrote their own history. And Maria Guadalupe, that it is in the middle, she was explaining her chapter in an auditorium in Nueva Esperanza, and her grandchildren were like, oh, I didn't know that you experienced all that. Thank you very much for this because I didn't know that history, and that's part of their memory. And I think that it is not just for academia but also for social organizations. Yeah. Hola.
Hello, my name is Ernie Capello, and I'm a professor in history and Latin American studies here. And I actually wanted to follow up on the images that you show sort of throughout the entire talk. And I guess there's sort of two questions. The first is I'd really love to know the story of the cover of the book because it's such an interesting sort of image, and sort of just thinking a bit about how that came together and how it speaks to the project more broadly. And then secondly, I was very struck by the way that the images are operating in your talk throughout the entire piece, where you had these wonderful portrait photography of the various people that you're working on and with, that really, I think, brings together some of the depth of the historical engagement of these pioneering women from the beginning of the 20th century through to the more contemporary people. And it was so interesting to see the kind of transformation of the players, the actors who were involved in this process, particularly culminating in these last images. And I was wondering, in particular, with the portraits of the authors of the book. First off, is everybody that is holding the book one of the people who were involved in it? So it was one other question. But I guess if you have any reflections on the power of these really beautiful, potent photographic portraits, and more generally as a way to kind of articulate the project that you're trying to work on, and decolonization and depatriarchalization, and how the visual component is either part of that, or perhaps in this moment of image conscious everything that we live in, is there a way that it repeats some of the kind of mediated vision of of what we might think of as almost colonial aspects of social media or other forms of personal representation?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very interesting question, and thank you for asking about the cover, because I forgot to say that Jani Gallegos made it. She's a feminist activist in Mexico, and she created this image for the March 8, 2020. But she wanted to represent not just mestizas, but indigenous and black or Afro-Mexican women in the protest. And I think that it is a very powerful image. And the other question, it is very interesting because I have never thought about that. The first images, I took it the most part of different archives. And I think that the majority of them were made by others. But the last images, it is very interesting because, for example, this picture was made by the Juana's sister, and I asked all the authors to send me a picture with the book, and they took their own picture, and I didn't think about that. I mean, it is not me that are taking the pictures, and for example, in this case, there were two photographers that are participating with the community from the 80s, Jose Angel Rodriguez and Alanis Rodriguez. And it is very interesting because Jose Angel Rodriguez, the only guy that is in the picture, he's the photographer, and he's a friend of my parents when I was a child. He took a lot of pictures in the refugee camps in Chiapas, where those women were living. And some years ago, he told me, Marisa, do you know what? I would like to go to Guatemala because I would like to give these pictures to those women. So one of my students was working. One of my students, that her name is Dalila Morales. She's a Mayan, indigenous woman. She was working with those women in Guatemala, those Mayan women. And so we went with Jose Angel Rodriguez to Guatemala. And when those women saw the pictures that Jose Angel took in the 80s, they were very surprised because they found some of their family members in the pictures that died, or some of them, for example, Maria Guadalupe, she discovered that she was in the pictures. So she showed this picture to her grandchildren. And I think that we can see that anthropology and is part of the imperial and colonial projects, but it's also, as Black feminist anthropology said, very useful for some purposes. And I think in this way, we can use in a different way anthropology. And for example, here, the other pictures, they did like a selfie. And so it is another way to represent their selves. Yeah, thank you for your question. No, just if you buy the book or if you read the book, send me a picture because I will be very happy to post it here. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.
I just want to remind everyone that we'll be back here at 8 o'clock for filmmaker Adam Khalil's talk about, I don't remember the exact title, but it's how to commit crimes against reality, yes. And also there is a reception in the wire housing foyer across the campus. So please, let's give another round of applause to Marisa Ruiz Trejo. And there will be a chance in Weyerhaeuser to engage more with her. So please come.